Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the show that takes your sources, your reading list, maybe even your own notes, and we really dig in to pull out the key insights. Our goal, to help you get genuinely well-informed fast. And today we've got a really fascinating journey planned. We're going to peel back some layers of history, looking at the kind of hidden origins of modern psychology, specifically how ancient Greek practices think things like temple medicine, oracles, how they secretly, maybe unexpectedly, shake the ideas of some really influential thinkers. We're focusing on two figures who were pivotal, but, well, they're often kind of eclipsed today. Karl Prel, that's 1839 to 1899, and Frederic W.H. Myers, 1843 to 1901. Their work actually came before giants like Freud and Jung and, arguably influenced them, yet you hardly hear their names in the standard histories.
Exactly. And that's the central puzzle for us today, isn't it? How could something that sounds like, well, ancient Greek magic or maybe superstition to modern ears, how could that be so foundational for psychology, a field that prides itself on being scientific? So this deep dive, we're going to unpack their pretty radical ideas, look at the intense reactions they stirred up, and maybe what that reveals about how history itself gets written.
It sounds like a story of forgotten pioneers and maybe some deliberate sidelining.
It really does. It touches on intellectual courage, definitely fierce opposition, and these foundational ideas that just got overlooked.
Okay, so let's start peeling back those layers. If we look beyond the standard story of psychology, who are these figures, Prel and Myers? You said they were significant back then.
Oh, absolutely. In the late 19th century, Karl Prel and Frederic Myers were, well, the sources say their contemporary significance was considerable. It's actually quite stark how much they've been overshadowed later by Freud and Jung.
So what was happening in psychology at that time? What was the backdrop for their work?
Right? You had to picture the scene. Psychology is this emerging field, mid to late 19th century. It's really fighting for legitimacy, trying to establish itself as a proper science. But many of the early efforts were focused on something quite specific, quite narrow,
Okay, like what?
like the basic mechanics of perception,
Yeah.
how we see, how we hear, but only in our normal, everyday waking state. Our sources describe it as a focus on the physiology of perception in the everyday waking self.
Right, the nuts and bolts.
Exactly. And this created a sense of, well, frustration among thinkers like Prel and Myers. They felt this approach completely missed huge parts of the human experience.
Like the unconscious, altered states.
Precisely. Consciousness beyond the ordinary, the deeper mechanics of the mind. They fundamentally believed this narrow physiological focus was just inadequate. It wasn't capturing the whole picture.
Okay, so that sets the stage for someone like Karl Prel. How did he try to broaden that picture?
Well, Prel didn't just tinker around the edges. He proposed what our sources call a radical research program for the study of altered states of consciousness.
Radical how?
He became arguably the most popular German language theorist of the unconscious, right before Freud took center stage. Think about that timing. He was a major voice on the unconscious before Freud really dominated the conversation.
Wow. And did this influence reach beyond academic circles?
Oh, definitely. He wasn't just read by academics. He was apparently revered by artists such as Rilke and Kandinsky, major figures in literature and art. They found inspiration in his ideas.
And the psychologists, James, Jung, Freud.
They all read him. William James, Carl Jung, even Sigmund Freud. They engaged with his work.
And Freud called him that brilliant mystic.
He did. That's a famous quote. And it's not just name-calling. Freud actually appropriated some of Prel's specific studies on dreams into his own developing theories. That's a direct link, a clear intellectual debt.
So this brilliant mystic, how did he connect psychology to, say, ancient Greek oracles? That seems like a huge leap.
It does. But for Prel, it wasn't. He had this specific, deep interest in ancient Greek oracles, temple medicine, and the demon of Socrates. And in his writings, like his 1888 book, The Mysticism of the Ancient Greeks, he didn't just describe these ancient practices. He actively put them side by side with modern phenomena.
Modern
Like self-diagnostic dreams, people dreaming the cause or cure for their illness. Or the phenomena seen in mesmerism, which was this early form of hypnotism involving animal magnetism. Also, more conventional medical hypnotism and even trance mediumship, spiritualist mediums claiming to channel spirits.
So he saw a connection between an ancient Greek temple and a 19th century seance.
In a way, yes. He was looking at the underlying psychological mechanisms. Take temple sleep or incubatio. This was common in the ancient world, often linked to the healing goddess Asclepius.
Right. People would sleep in the temple hoping for a cure in a dream.
Exactly. Patients would spend nights there seeking healing or advice from the god delivered via dreams. Sounds quite mystical, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Divine intervention in dreams.
But that's not quite how Prel saw it. His interpretation was much more psychological, actually. He argued that the successful cures weren't necessarily direct divine acts.
So what were they then?
He believed they stemmed from the patient's own innate knowledge of their organism, and maybe even instinctive clairvoyant identifications of remedies,
Whoa. So the god in the dream was actually...
a part of the patient's own unconscious self. For Prel, these entities appearing in curative dreams were fragments of the patient's unconscious self. Almost like the unconscious mind was talking to the conscious mind, diagnosing and prescribing through the drama of a dream. It's suggesting a kind of internal wisdom.
That's quite a pre-Freudian idea of the unconscious at work, healing from within.
Absolutely. And he took this idea, his transcendental psychology of the unconscious, and connected it further. He looked at the famous demon of Socrates.
The inner voice, Socrates said, guided him.
That's the one. Prel argued that the experience of temple sleep, the experience of hearing an oracle, the experience of Socrates' demon, these all mirrored what his contemporaries were seeing in cases of benign double consciousness during mesmerism, hypnotism, or even in spiritualist mediums.
So he saw a pattern across history in different states of consciousness.
Yes, he wasn't just making historical points. He was actively urging psychologists and anthropologists of his day to compare these things. He thought they all pointed to deeper shared human capacities for accessing, well, hidden layers of the mind.
Okay, so Prel lays this groundwork. Then Frederic Myers enters the picture.
Right. Myers really took up Prel's research program, as the sources put it. He didn't just adopt it, he advanced it, developing it into a distinct strand of British psychological experimentation.
Experimentation. So this wasn't just theory?
No, Myers was very empirical in his approach, and he wasn't shy about it. He actually presented this work, this psychological investigation of the unconscious, often through studying mediums, automatic writing, things like that, at the first 4 international congresses of psychology.
Putting it right in front of the scientific establishment.
Exactly, demanding they take it seriously.
And did key figures take it seriously? You mentioned endorsements.
Big ones. People like Theodore Flournoy, a key figure in Swiss psychology, and especially William James.
The William James.
Yeah.
Father of American psychology.
The very same. James didn't just support Myers, he championed him. There's this incredible quote where James called Myers' work on an experimental psychology of the unconscious the most important step forward that has occurred in psychology.
That's huge, coming from James.
It really is. It shows you just how significant Myers was, considered by some of the absolute giants of the field at the time.
So what was Myers' specific focus within this, similar to Prel's?
He shared the deep interest in oracles and the demon of Socrates. Definitely, though maybe less focused on the specifics of temple medicine itself. His big 1880 study on oracles is really key. In it, he took aim at Enlightenment writers like Bernard de Fontenelle.
What was his issue with them?
He felt they'd basically dismissed the whole Greek oracle tradition, just reinterpreting it as scams run by corrupt pagan priesthoods, purely fraud and delusion. Myers argued this was a completely narrow, prejudiced view that ignored any potential psychological depth or genuine experience.
So he was pushing back against reducing everything to just superstition or fraud.
Yes, and that connects to another important point. He was also indirectly challenging the dominant anthropological theories of his day, ideas about animism and fetishism.
So?
Well, those theories basically said that any modern belief in the occult, spiritualism, psychic phenomena, whatever, was a kind of sickness, a pathological relapse into supposedly savage or primitive ways of thinking from earlier stages of human development.
So if you believed in ghosts, you were mentally devolving.
Yeah, pretty much. Myers strongly resisted that kind of dismissive, often culturally biased framework.
And this led him to his own theory, the subliminal self.
Exactly. Building on these ideas of a deeper mind, Myers developed this concept of the subliminal self. He used it to interpret things like the Socratic demon and the voices heard by Jane d'Arc.
So Socrates' inner voice and Joan of Arc's voices were manifestations of this deeper self.
That was his argument. He saw them as expressions of this vast subliminal consciousness lying beneath our normal waking awareness, a part of us capable of insights, creativity, maybe even perceptions that seem extraordinary.
Okay, so pulling Prel and Myers together, what's the shared vision here?
The core idea, the shared perspective, was that all these different things, ancient Greek oracles, Socrates' demon, Jeanne d'Arc's voices, other historical examples of people seeming to have divided selves, but in a positive or benign way, maybe even showing clairvoyance or telepathy sometimes. Yeah. That all of these were phenomenologically continuous, meaning they shared essential experiential qualities with the things they were seeing in their own time. The dynamics of dreams, the effects of hypnotism, the results of automatic writing experiments, the experiences of trance mediums.
So, not just isolated curiosities, but part of a bigger spectrum of human consciousness.
Precisely. For them, these weren't disconnected superstitions. They were diverse expressions of a deep, universal potential within the human mind, a continuity of experience across time and culture.
Now, with endorsements like William James's, you'd think these ideas would have been welcomed, right? Integrated into the new science of psychology.
You might think so. But, this is where the story gets really contentious. While some, like James and Flournoy, absolutely embraced this integrative approach, well, let's just say other pioneers of the psychological profession had little sympathy.
Little sympathy is putting it mildly.
Very mildly. They actively, vehemently opposed these ideas.
Who were the main opponents, and why such strong opposition?
We're talking about major figures. Wilhelm Wundt, often called the father of experimental psychology, Joseph Jastrow, G. Stanley Hall. Big names. Their motivation. It seems largely driven by a desire to protect the reputation of psychology. They were desperate for it to be seen as a rigorous, respectable science.
And things like oracles and mediums didn't fit that image.
Not at all. So they launched these public campaigns to shield the fledgling psychological profession from unwanted associations with superstition and any ideas that didn't fit the enlightened scientific norms of the day. And crucially, our sources point out, this drive to exclude these topics still shapes the way many psychologists write the history of their discipline. The echoes are still there.
Wow, so how did they fight back? What were their arguments against Prel and Myers?
Well, their major weapon, according to the sources, was to lean heavily on those anthropological concepts we mentioned, atavistic fetishisms.
Atavistic meaning, like a throwback.
Exactly. They basically framed any interest in altered states, mesmerism, spiritualism, or these historical parallels as pathological. They called it a dangerous survival of psychological traits from past stages of human development.
So instead of debating the evidence, they essentially said, anyone interested in this stuff is mentally regressing.
That was the gist of it, yeah. It wasn't about calm critique. It was about pathologizing the interest itself. This isn't science. It's a dangerous throwback to primitive thinking.
And this linked back to how they viewed ancient practices.
Absolutely. Those anthropological theories they used weren't neutral observers. They started with the assumption, programmatically assumed, the source says that ancient oracles had an intrinsically morbid and regressive kinship with shamanic practices in indigenous cultures and with modern spirit mediumship.
So they prejudged oracles as unhealthy or primitive from the start.
Yes. And by linking them to contemporary spiritualism, which was already controversial and feared by many, they could effectively weaponize those fears. It became a way to discredit Prel and Myers by association, painting their research as not just wrong, but somehow dangerous and intellectually backward.
A pretty effective, if maybe unfair, tactic.
Highly effective in shaping the narrative, certainly.
Were there any other voices trying to bridge this gap? Maybe someone slightly less controversial than Prel or Myers?
There were. Andrew Lang is an interesting figure here. He was a Scottish folklorist and anthropologist living around the same time, 1844 to 1912. He's described as another unorthodox voice.
How did he fit into this debate?
Well, Lang was actually dismissive of some of the more controversial phenomena that Prel, Myers, James, and Flournoy were looking into, probably the more extreme claims about spirit communication, things like that.
Oh, okay, so a bit more skeptical.
A bit more skeptical, yes. But, and this is key, he still relied on Myers' experimental studies. Specifically, the work on automatic writing, hypnotism, and other techniques that seem to induce these secondary selves or altered states, even in mentally healthy people.
So he accepted the empirical side of Myers' work.
It seems so. He saw value in that experimental approach to understanding these divided states of mind. And Lang used this. He used Myers' findings to try and explain historical puzzles like the voices of Jeanne d'Arc. And importantly, he used it to critique the dominant anthropological school of thought at the time, the Taylorian school, named after Edward Burnett Tyler.
The school that tended to label things as primitive.
Exactly. Lang pushed back against that simplistic view, using Myers' more nuanced psychological findings. This all culminated in his big study, The Making of Religion, where he really challenged those established anthropological frameworks.
Okay, so looking back at this whole complex picture, Prel, Myers, Lang, their opponents, what's the big takeaway for us today?
I think the main point is realizing that writers like Duprel, Myers, and even Lang, despite being somewhat muted voices in the standard history now, played a crucial role. They acted as a counterweight, a counterbalance to figures like Tyler or Wundt, who were maybe more aligned with the intellectual mainstream of the 19th century.
A mainstream that was, as you said, maybe overly fearful of certain topics.
Yes, the sources describe the period as being marked by an almost irrational fear of the occult. These writers offered a different lens, challenging the way the past was being interpreted, these modernist appropriations of the past, and questioning the narrow definition of what constituted valid psychological inquiry.
So the foundation of psychology wasn't as neat and tidy as we might think.
Not at all. The takeaway for you, our listener, is really this. The origins of psychology are far more complex, way more contested, and honestly, much more interesting than the standard textbook story often allows. It reveals this deep, ongoing tension right from the start, a battle between what gets labeled scientific and what gets dismissed as superstitious or primitive. And you have to wonder, how much does that initial tension still, perhaps subtly, shape how we approach the mind and consciousness even now?
It really makes you think. We've uncovered this hidden story, haven't we? How these ancient ideas about dreams, consciousness, healing weren't just fringe interests, but actually central to the thinking of pioneers like Carl Prel and Frederic Myers. And how they're really quite radical views connecting ancient temple sleep to 19th century hypnotism ran into such fierce opposition from those trying to, well, shield the new science of psychology. So the question lingers, doesn't it? What does it mean for a scientific discipline when its very foundations were forged in these intense battles over what's legitimate to even ask? How might that foundational conflict still ripple outwards, affecting how we think about our own minds today? Definitely something to mull over. Now, if this deep dive has piqued your interest, I hope it has. We've really only managed to scratch the surface here today. There's so much more to explore. We strongly encourage you to dig deeper. You'll find a curated list of recommended readings, including works by Duprel and Myers themselves, and other relevant texts right there in the description box for this deep dive. And if you enjoyed this exploration, if you feel like you learned something new or maybe saw history in a slightly different light, please do take a second to like this episode. And make sure you subscribe to the deep dive so you don't miss out on our future explorations. Finally, if you know someone else who loves getting well informed or who just has that intense curiosity about the world, please share this deep dive with them. It really helps us reach more listeners like you. Thanks for joining us.